Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. This podcast is designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know, all in 20 minutes. I'm your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Show notes plus photos or recommended reading transcripts can be found on each associated episode's webpage. Simply go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast. Don't forget, if you enjoy what we do, then please rate and review. It warms the cockles of my heart to read your appreciation of this labour of love. Get that cup of tea, put your feet up, and enjoy. To date, we have 17 podcast episodes covering different aspects of Georgian life, and I thought a general overview of Georgian London would be useful in helping to create context. I have listed all the relevant episodes in the show notes if you want to listen to those later on. Simply go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast and click on episode 87, Georgian London. Only one of Queen Anne's 17 pregnancies produced a potential heir, William, Duke of Gloucester. His death at the tender age of 11 caused Parliament to institute the Act of Settlement, making Electress Sophia of Hanover heiress presumptive. Electress Sophia died 2 months before Queen Anne. So the Georgian period began in 1714 when Georg, Elector of Hanover, second cousin to Queen Anne, became George I. George was an appealing choice to Parliament as he was a Protestant and was willing to share the responsibility of rule with them. James Stuart, the heir to the throne by blood, was Catholic. During the 123 years of the Georgian period, 5 monarchs reigned. Slavery was abolished, the Americas were lost, and the Gregorian calendar was adopted, replacing the Julian. A new type of society emerged in Britain, a more free, diverse and enlightened society. British culture at its time was a mix of the conventional and the revolutionary. The Georgian age was considered to be elegant and polite. As with the sweet comes the sour, the age of Hogarth, a time of speculation, squalor and satire. Georgian London was a fascinating time and place. It was a time of great change and the city was growing rapidly. So in this podcast, we'll be exploring some of the most interesting aspects of Georgian London, joining it all up, and we'll look at the architecture, the culture and the people who made it their home, and how some of them are remembered and others deliberately forgotten. Without further ado, let's travel back to Georgian London. The 18th century was a period of rapid growth for London, reflecting an increasing national population, the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution, and London's role as the centre of the evolving British Empire. London's boundaries began to expand. Britain undertook its first census in 1801 with the aim of capturing the nation's population. According to the GLA's data store, Greater London was the host of 1,097,000 people. 939,000 of those were living or staying in inner London and 162,000 in outer London. The London areas with the largest populations were the City of Westminster with 231,000, Tower Hamlets with 144,000, City of London followed with 129,000 and Southwark followed closely by with 116,000. Camden had reached 100,000. Figure estimates are to the nearest thousand. By the end of the 18th century, about 1/10 of the population of Great Britain lived in London. On a London level, significant changes were afoot. The sharp population increase drove the demand of new infrastructure, such as new roads, Regent Street, for example, and also the New Road. New housing was needed. Hamlets and small villages, such as Chelsea and Islington, grew. Brand new residential areas were built too, such as Belgravia and Pimlico. People from across the country and indeed the world moved to London, some running away from their past lives. Most people didn't own their own home but rented rooms. The best room of the house was at the front, whereas the cheaper rooms were in the garrets. Home was where you rested your head. People were highly mobile, sometimes only renting rooms for a couple of months. This, along with badly behaved tenants, created challenges for Georgian landladies and landlords. And you can hear more about that in episodes 78 and 79. New infrastructure such as bridges and roads were created in order to accommodate the growing population of Londoners. New transportation networks were developed. The Regent's Canal was built to move produce across London, and London-born George Shillibeer launched London's first omnibuses along the New Road. The railway first entered London in the 1830s. The first section of the London and Greenwich Railway was built on a viaduct between Spa Road, Bermondsey, and Deptford near Greenwich. It was the first occasion where locomotives ran over a proper railway in the London district. Despite large city challenges such as poverty, disease and crime, London was a thriving and exciting place to live during the Georgian era. The people were creative and industrious, and there were many new opportunities available for those who were willing to seize them. In spite of its drawbacks, Georgian London was a fascinating place to explore and experience. We often say now that London is a building site, and it was the same back then. They were building for the future. Their style, elegant but grand. Some key developments, including the construction of new roads, bridges and public buildings, new markets and fairs began, thereby bolstering the local economy. The construction of Regent Street, now one of the most famous streets in London, and Trafalgar Square were part of a redevelopment project ordered by George IV. An increased interest in classical architecture saw it reflected on the streets of London, with the British Museum, the world's first national museum, and the Lord Mayor's Mansion House being built along with the new style of Georgian terraces. The Westminster Paving Act required streets be equipped with pavements, drainage and lighting. The next year saw the same provision extended across the whole city with the London Paving and Lighting Act. Houses were numbered and streets and pavements were cleaned and swept regularly. Street lighting was more extensive than in any other city in Europe, something which amazed foreign visitors when visiting the capital. Some of London's iconic fixtures were removed during this period as well, including the 7 ancient gates enclosing the City of London, and this improved the movement of traffic, but also the 40-plus houses that used to be on London Bridge. Westminster Bridge was London's second overland crossing, opening in 1750. The one you can see now is Victorian, however. And Blackfriars Bridge, opening 19 years later, designed by the 26-year-old architect Robert Milne, and he really loved the elegant classical style, and it had 9 semi-elliptical arches of Portland stone. It had originally been known as William Pitt Bridge after the Prime Minister, but was changed when he fell out of favour. The Age of Enlightenment was now in full swing. Thomas Paine's Right of Man was published, as was Mary Wollstonecraft's Rights of Woman, both writers having strong connections with Islington. Fanny Burney and Jane Austen published novels, and Dr. Samuel Johnson published a dictionary of the English language. The great enlightened thinker Voltaire spent a couple of years enjoying London's charms. Scientific discovery became the new frontier. Captain Cook embarked on 3 voyages. Erasmus Darwin became the first Briton to explicitly write about evolution. Michael Faraday grew up near Oxford Street and lived at the Royal Institution in Mayfair, founding the Royal Institution Christmas lectures and discovering electromagnetic induction. Renowned experimental scientist Benjamin Franklin crossed the Atlantic and came back to London, this time to live as a gentleman. The study and teaching of medicine was reaching a new age, with Doctors John and William Hunter leading at the experimental and non-institutional front. Dentistry was in its infancy, with many people going to the local barber for a tooth extraction. That is, if they didn't fancy doing a DIY job at home. Religion was changing too. John Wesley, leader of the Methodist movement, first moved to London for school, where he was a pupil at Charterhouse. The house he lived in as an adult for over a decade stands next to his first purpose-built chapel. It's one of the finest surviving small Georgian townhouses in London, and is somewhere you can visit even today. Terror of the supernatural was widespread in the 18th century. Methodists argued that ghosts may be real. Even though this was supposed to be the Age of Enlightenment, many of our Georgian ancestors regarded the threat of the paranormal as real and terrifying, and that left them vulnerable to the ghost hoax. Cue Scratching Fanny of Cock Lane, episode 28. Coffeehouses were popular in Georgian London, especially among the city's writers and artists. These establishments served coffee and tea, as well as pastries and other snacks. They were often used as meeting places, where people would gather to discuss current events or share ideas. They were known for their lively debates and discussions, which sometimes turned into arguments. And it's also the period of great growth in newspaper publications. The newspapers would be subscribed, and you could go and read them in the coffee houses. But also a lot of the news was actually produced in the coffee houses themselves. Some of the most famous coffee houses in Georgian London were Lloyd's, Garraway's and John Russell's. Lloyd's was particularly popular among merchants and ship owners, while Garraway's was frequented by politicians and journalists. John Russell's was a favourite spot for artists and writers. Before the financial revolution, if you wanted to invest your wealth, you would have put it into land. But now, regular people could invest. That created opportunities to financially profit from trading, and indeed to lose significant amounts, such as in the South Sea Bubble, episode 27. It was also the age of the gentleman. The number of testosterone-filled gentlemen clubs increased. The Hellfire Club was founded, and that was the name for several exclusive clubs for high society rakes. The clubs were, in effect, second homes in the centre of London, where men could relax, mix with their friends, play parlour games, get a meal, and in some clubs, stay overnight. More about those in a future episode. Later on in the period, men no longer wore wigs or carried swords in public. From the early 1700s, duelling was made illegal. Hyde Park was ungated and so became one of the most popular venues in the 18th century for settling affairs of honour. Bare knuckle fighting was one of the most popular sports in later Georgian period. Specialist sporter writer, London-born Piers Egan, published accounts of the matches in great detail in the newspapers. Prince of Wales attended many mills along with famous gentlemen of the time. Boxing wasn't only a spectator sport. Poet Lord Byron noted in his diary that he took regular boxing lessons and that he considered boxing a sport that developed both the body and the mind. a widespread concept at the time. Fencing became an acceptable form of exercise for an English gentleman, think Mr. Darcy. Gentlemen's sports clubs offered classes as well as boxing. Fencing was then one of a gentleman's necessary accomplishments, along with riding and dancing. Cricket, rugby and golf were also created during this time. This wasn't a time for peace. There were 3 quash Jacobite rebellions. George II was the last British monarch to lead troops into battle at the Battle of Deddington in Germany. Oh, and of course, the 7 Years' War. It was an era of national heroes, such as General James Wolfe at the capture of Quebec, Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, and the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. The statue of General Wolfe stands tall on the top of the hill at Greenwich Park, overlooking the Royal Borough. He was a local boy who is best known for his training reforms and his victory over the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec as a Major General. He rests in the crypt of St Elphege, Greenwich, with a plaque and painting to ensure he's remembered. Nelson, also with Greenwich connections, is remembered more grandly with Trafalgar Square, even though it was originally to be named for William IV, commemorating his ascent to the throne. The Duke of Wellington's London legacy is extensive and warrants an episode on its own. For the first 7 years of a project to build what we now know as Waterloo Bridge, it was going to be called the Strand Bridge, but was renamed as a lasting record to the brilliant and decisive victory achieved by His Majesty's forces in conjunction with those of his allies. And Prince Regent opened that on the 2nd anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Both Nelson and Wellington rest in impressive tombs in St Paul's Cathedral. There were changes afoot in the royal family too. For most of the period, the princes of Wales maintained their courts in town houses rather than grand palaces. They behaved as though fashionable members of the aristocracy, making them perceived to be more of the people. The Prince Regent moved into Carlton House on Pall Mall, having been remodelled by John Nash, and was now a palace befitting the son of George III, a new palace in all but name. Buckingham House was built as a private home for the Duke of Buckingham until George III acquired the whole site as a private family residence for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their children. The Queen's room ceilings were designed by Robert Adam and painted by Giovanni Battista Cipriani, making them some of the most sophisticated of their time. It wasn't until the 1820s when George IV commissioned John Nash to create most of the Buckingham Palace we recognise today. Politically, it was an age of advancement too. Sir Robert Walpole became Britain's first ever Prime Minister, and William Pitt the Younger became Britain's youngest Prime Minister to date at the age of 23. The Reform Act 1832 was the catalyst for the amendment of some acts, including the Factory Act, which restricted the working hours of women and children. The Poor Law Amendment Act halted government payments to the able-bodied poor unless they entered workhouses, and thereby establishing workhouses as the main means of providing welfare. This inspired authors such as the young Charles Dickens to focus his written works on the social injustices and gaining the title Spokesman of the Poor. The Parish Boy's Progress, more commonly known as Oliver Twist, was his first novel to realistically depict the impoverished London underworld and illustrates his belief that poverty leads to crime. The Somerset case led the way to the Slavery Abolition Act, which abolished slavery in most of Britain's colonies. Britain started shipping convicts to its American colonies before they then started to transport them to Australia 69 years later. Arts and culture flourished. This was an era bursting with artists, painters such as Sir Joshua Reynolds, George Romney, John Constable, Joseph Turner and William Hogarth. Young Hogarth lived in Clerkenwell before moving to Leicester Square to join Reynolds. Romney and Constable sought the fresh air of Hampstead Village, where Constable and his family now rest in peace. Turner grew up in Maiden Lane, Covent Garden, and lived in Marylebone for 40 years and had a country house in Twickenham. The Royal Academy was established within the walls of Somerset House, becoming the first resident of a newly built Somerset House in what is now known as the North Wing. Nash had plans for a new home for the Academy in what was to become Trafalgar Square, but that never materialised. Georg Friedrich Handel was appointed composer to the Chapel Royal, composing British patriotic anthems such as Zadok the Priest for the coronation of King George II. It has since been sung prior to the anointing of the sovereign of the coronation of every British monarch since its composition. A young Mozart stayed for 15 months, moving between Soho and Pimlico and performing at the new Buckingham Palace no less than 3 times. It was a time of great dramatists such as David Garrick and Edmund Kean. Garrick was an actor, playwright and theatre manager who lived in Covent Garden. He's now got a London street and a theatre named after him. London-born Edmund Kean was a celebrated Shakespearean stage actor, and he trod the boards of the West End, but also Windsor Castle, and he retired to Richmond. Both Garrick and Kean are remembered with monuments in the rotunda of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. London-born Joseph Grimaldi drew the audiences in with his slapstick comedy and gin-infused wit. His final resting place is along the New Road, where you can dance upon his grave. Quite literally. Theatre was a huge part of Georgian London culture. There were dozens of theatres in the city, and they were all incredibly popular. Theatres were where people went to see new plays, hear music, and enjoy other forms of entertainment, including opera. People flocked to pleasure gardens. The most famous of all was Vauxhall. Live music, fireworks, and the biggest names of the day drew the crowds. Mock naval battles were staged on the Serpentine in Hyde Park, depicting the British defeat of the French, which ended with the French fleet being set on fire. Fireworks, water rockets, and a grand fair delighted the crowds further. Food was important too. From the 1700s, cookery writing really took off. Hannah Glass wrote a cookery book called The Art of Cookery, which was a big success. This was a time when jelly and ice cream were high-stake foods, rather than being the children's party food of today. In the English countryside, ingredients were for the most part grown or bought locally, and word travelled quickly in small communities. Meat came from local farms or estates, and farmers and landowners had reputations to maintain, as did the local mill for flour and the local shopkeepers for all that they sold. It was a different story in the cities, including London. Shopkeepers and costermongers would source, store, prepare and supply the produce. A wider market meant that tradesmen were often less concerned with quality as they were with cost. The worst affected were the poor, often living from hand to mouth, buying food in pennies worth or even eightpennies worth. Fashion changed for both men and women. For the women, the most notable difference was the waistline. At the beginning of the era, the waistline was at the natural level. At the end, it was directly underneath the bust, what we now call the Empire line. Georgian women often wore stays before the corsets really came in, and they had 2 separate gussets that held each breast separately. They were made out of fabric, and they were soft, and they didn't have any boning in them. Men's fashion changed too, emphasising the shoulders, with neat waists and an emphasis on the hips, legs and groin, which were now more visible for the first time in quite some time. Men had the option of using supportive undergarments to keep them trim. If a gentleman wanted to keep an eye on his weight, he could go to what is now one of the oldest shops in London, Berry Brothers and Rudd in St James's. And if you go there now, you'll notice a large pair of scales, and these date from 1765 and they're huge, and many notable customers have been weighed here, such as Pitt the Younger, Lord Byron, Beau Brummell, and the Prince Regent. Boots were practical exercise footwear. Society men, such as London-born Beau Brummell, popularised the fashion of new trousers. The Georgian era ended with the death of William IV, June 1837, and his niece, the 18-year-old princess, became Queen Victoria. If you've enjoyed this episode, then you might also enjoy several blog posts that we have about the Georgian era. And you can do that by going to londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Hover over London History in the menu and then go down to Georgian London, and there you will see all of our tours, our blog posts and associated imagery, and indeed further podcast episodes for you to listen to. And yes, I do a Georgian London walk, also available as a private tour. My colleagues as well do a Belgravia and a wonderful Pimlico tour if you want to get back into the Regency era. That's all for now. See you next time.